I want you to picture this with me for a second. It is 5:30 in the morning. It is pitch black outside. The temperature is sitting somewhere around 8 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind is howling so hard that it sounds like a freight train is running directly through my living room wall, and there is close to 2 feet of snow sitting on my driveway with more falling every single minute. My truck is buried. My mailbox is buried. My front porch railing is buried. Everything is buried. The whole street looks like someone dropped a giant white blanket over the entire neighborhood and walked away laughing. And me. I am standing in my kitchen in my work boots and my heavy Carhartt jacket with a cup of coffee in my hand, watching the snow pile up even higher through my kitchen window, mentally preparing myself to go out there and fight it. That was the morning everything changed between me and the Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Association. And by changed, I mean the morning Pamela Covington decided to make my life a living nightmare over the dumbest thing I have ever had to defend myself against in 41 years of being alive. Let me back up and give you some context, because the story makes a lot more sense when you understand the full picture of what Maplewood Ridge was like before that blizzard hit. I moved into Maplewood Ridge about 4 years ago. Nice neighborhood, decent houses, good setback from the main road, plenty of mature trees. My house is a colonial, 4 bedrooms, 2-car garage, long driveway that curves slightly to the left from the street. The HOA was something I sort of shrugged at when I bought the place. Every neighborhood has one. Most of the time they just make sure people keep their lawns cut and do not paint their front doors neon orange. I figured I could deal with it. I am a reasonably cooperative person. I follow the rules when the rules make sense. I pay my dues. I have never had a pink flamingo in my yard or a broken couch on my porch. I thought we were going to be fine. What I did not account for was Pamela Covington. Pamela Covington was on the HOA board. Technically, she was the Covenant Compliance Officer, which is a very fancy title for someone who drives around the neighborhood in a silver Lexus SUV looking for reasons to send people violation notices. She had been on that board for 7 years by the time I moved in, and from what the neighbors told me, she had been escalating her level of petty enforcement every single year. What started as her sending out letters about improperly stored garbage cans had grown into her levying fines on people for parking 1 inch over the edge of their driveway, for having a garden hose coiled too loosely on the side of the house, and for one memorable incident, fining a guy 3 houses down from me because his basketball hoop was 6 inches too close to the sidewalk, according to her own measurement, which, when the city came out and measured it officially, turned out to be completely wrong. But the board kept backing her up. That was the thing. She had 2 other board members in her pocket, a couple named Gerald and Sandra Whitmore who had been on the board almost as long as she had, and who seemed to genuinely believe that Pamela was doing God's work keeping the neighborhood standards up. The 3 of them formed this little coalition that could outvote anybody else on the board, and they used it constantly. The other 2 board members, a younger guy named Felix Torres and a retired schoolteacher named Donna Hewitt, were regularly steamrolled by Pamela and her crew. Felix and Donna both told me privately on multiple occasions that they hated the direction things were going, but felt like they could not do much about it. So that was the landscape I was living in. Pamela Covington running a low-grade reign of terror over a nice suburban neighborhood, armed with a clipboard, a covenant document, and apparently nothing better to do with her time. Now, back to the blizzard. The storm had been building for 3 days. The weather forecast was calling for somewhere between 18 and 24 inches of accumulation, with wind gusts up to 40 miles per hour, and temperatures that were not going to crack 20 degrees for the next 48 hours. This was not a garden-variety winter storm. This was one of those once-a-decade events where schools shut down 3 days in advance, grocery store shelves get wiped out within 6 hours of the first forecast, and the local news anchors start doing their best dramatic reading voices while standing outside in parkas. I work in property management, which means I have to be somewhere doing something even when most people are staying home. I had 3 commercial properties I was responsible for that week, and I knew from experience that if I let my driveway go uncleared during a storm like this one, I was going to be completely trapped for days. My driveway is about 60 feet long and runs at a slight downhill slope toward the street, which means when you get significant snow accumulation, and then the temperature drops overnight and everything ices over, you essentially have a glacier between yourself and the rest of the world. So I had planned ahead. I own a snowblower, a solid mid-range 2-stage unit that I bought 2 winters ago specifically, because I knew what winters in this part of the country could look like. I also have a truck with a plow attachment that I use for my own driveway and occasionally help a few neighbors with. That plow attachment had been sitting in my garage since October, ready to go. The storm started rolling in hard late on Thursday night. By midnight, there was already a foot on the ground and it was still coming down at a rate of about 2 inches per hour. By 3 in the morning when I got up to check, it was somewhere between 18 and 20 inches and still going. The wind was absolutely screaming. I could hear it shaking the windows. My neighbor Tom Garrettson's big oak tree in his front yard was making these deep groaning sounds every time a gust hit it. I made my decision around 5:15 in the morning. I was going to have to leave by 7:30 to make it to my first property by 9, and with roads in the condition they were in and a driveway that was now buried under nearly 2 feet of snow and still accumulating, I needed to start immediately. I suited up. Heavy boots, insulated bibs, work jacket, gloves, balaclava, the whole setup. I went out to the garage, warmed up the truck for about 10 minutes, attached the plow, and started clearing my driveway just after 6 o'clock. Now here is the thing about plowing a driveway at 6 in the morning. It is loud. I know it is loud. I am not going to pretend otherwise. A truck with a plow attachment making multiple passes on a 60-foot concrete driveway is not a quiet operation. But here is the other thing. It was the middle of a blizzard. The wind alone was already making enough noise to rattle windows. Half the neighborhood had no power. The storm itself was producing constant sound, and I was not the only person who was going to need to clear their property that morning. I was just the first one awake and doing it. I finished my driveway in about 25 minutes. Then I did a quick pass on the sidewalk in front of my house, because the HOA covenant actually required sidewalk clearance within 24 hours of a snowfall ending, and I figured getting a head start was smart. I helped Tom Garrettson clear the end of his driveway because his snowblower had seized up, and he was out there with a shovel looking absolutely defeated. Then I went back inside, changed my boots, ate some breakfast, and got ready to leave. The violation notice arrived 3 days later. Not a letter, not a phone call, not a polite knock on the door. A printed violation notice tucked into my door with the HOA letterhead on it, and Pamela Covington's signature at the bottom. It read, and I am not exaggerating even slightly, that I had been cited for operating motorized machinery in a residential area during quiet hours, specifically between the hours of 7:00 p.m. and 7:00 a.m., in violation of Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the Maplewood Ridge HOA Community Standards and Covenant Agreement, and that I was being assessed a fine of $250. $250. For plowing my own driveway during a blizzard at 6 in the morning. I stood there in my doorway reading that notice probably 4 times, certain I was misunderstanding something. But no, that was exactly what it said. I had been fined $250 for the crime of making sure I could get out of my own house during a record snowfall. And just to make the moment even more perfect, I looked out at the street while I was standing there in my doorway, and the street was still completely buried. The city plow had not been through since the middle of the storm. There were cars on the street that were buried up to their door handles. Tom Garrettson's mailbox was still just a lump in the snow with its little red flag poking out. The Hendersons across the street had not even attempted their driveway yet because they did not have the equipment to deal with it. The Pattersons on the corner had hired a plow service that was so backed up they were not going to get to their house until the following day. The entire street looked like a snow globe that someone had just shaken. And here I was, holding a $250 fine for being the one person who had actually done something about it. I will be honest with you. My first reaction was something between laughing and being genuinely furious. And for about 30 seconds, those two feelings were fighting each other for control of my face. Then the fury won, and I went inside and sat down at my kitchen table and started thinking about how I was going to handle this. Because I was not paying that fine. Not for this. Not ever. The first thing I did was pull out my copy of the HOA governing documents. I had kept them in a folder in my file cabinet since I moved in, which turned out to be more useful than I had anticipated. I flipped to Section 12, Paragraph 4, which Pamela had cited in the violation notice. And I read it very carefully. Here is what the actual language said. It said that the operation of motorized recreational vehicles, including but not limited to all-terrain vehicles, golf carts, and similar equipment, in a manner that disturbs the peace and quiet of the community, is prohibited between the hours of 7:00 p.m. and 7:00 a.m. Recreational vehicles, all-terrain vehicles, golf carts. There was not a single word in that paragraph about snow removal equipment. Not a word about snowblowers, not a word about plow trucks, not a word about any kind of maintenance or emergency-related machinery. The entire section was clearly written to prevent people from ripping around the neighborhood on ATVs or golf carts at 2 in the morning. It had nothing to do with clearing a private driveway of 2 feet of snow during a state-declared winter storm emergency. And there was my first card. The violation notice was citing the wrong provision entirely. Pamela had either misread the covenant on purpose, or she had simply decided that the provision could be stretched to mean whatever she wanted it to mean on any given morning. I also went and looked up the county ordinances online, because I had a feeling the HOA rules had to comply with them. And sure enough, there was a county ordinance that specifically addressed snow removal. It said that property owners were expected to clear snow from their driveways and walkways in a timely manner following any snowfall, and that this activity was considered a necessary maintenance function not subject to noise ordinance restrictions, provided it did not occur before 5 in the morning. I had started at 6. I was completely within the county ordinance on both counts. I drafted a response letter to the HOA that same evening. I laid it out point by point. First, Section 12, Paragraph 4 applies specifically to recreational vehicles and does not include snow removal equipment. Second, the county ordinance explicitly exempts snow removal from noise restrictions for work beginning after 5 a.m. Third, I had begun at 6 a.m., which complied with both the county ordinance and any reasonable interpretation of the HOA covenant. Fourth, I was requesting that the fine be rescinded immediately and that a written confirmation of rescission be provided within 14 days. I sent the letter by certified mail to the HOA management company and sent a copy directly to every board member I had an email address for, which was all 5 of them. Then I made copies of everything and put them in a folder. I also, on a hunch, went and checked my garage security camera footage from that morning. I have cameras at both corners of my garage pointing out toward the driveway and the street, and they timestamp everything automatically. I pulled up the footage and confirmed that I had started running the plow at 6:03 in the morning, which was also helpful to have documented. I saved that footage to a thumb drive and backed it up to cloud storage. Then I waited. The response I got back from the HOA was not the apology and rescission I had requested. It was a letter signed by Pamela Covington on HOA letterhead, informing me that my appeal had been reviewed by the board and denied, that the fine stood, and that I had 30 days to pay or an additional $100 late fee would be added. There was a line in the letter, and this is the part that really got under my skin, that said the board had determined that the operation of any motorized vehicle producing significant noise and vibration during quiet hours constitutes a violation of the spirit and intent of Section 12, Paragraph 4. The spirit and intent. She was not even trying to argue that the language covered my situation. She was going with the spirit and intent, which meant she knew perfectly well the actual language did not support the fine, and she was just hoping I would get frustrated and pay it anyway. That was when I decided this was going to go further. I posted about the situation on the neighborhood Facebook group that evening, not in a dramatic, angry way, just factually. I wrote a post explaining what had happened, sharing a screenshot of the violation notice, summarizing my response letter, and asking if anyone else had received similar fines for snow removal during the blizzard. I also mentioned that the city had actually sent out a message during the storm asking residents to clear their driveways and walkways as soon as safely possible to help emergency vehicles access properties. The response was immediate and almost overwhelming. Within 2 hours, I had 63 comments. Within 4 hours, I had over 100. People were furious, and not just on my behalf. It turned out that Pamela had actually sent violation notices to 4 other households in the neighborhood during or immediately after the blizzard. One family had been cited for having snow equipment parked in their driveway for longer than 12 hours, which apparently violated some provision about vehicle storage. Another neighbor had been cited for shoveling their walkway onto the edge of their lawn rather than into their own yard, because apparently the covenant had something to say about where removed snow could be deposited. A third household had gotten a notice for having an unsanctioned temporary shelter cover over their firewood pile that they had set up to keep the wood dry during the storm. And a fourth family had been cited for inadequate holiday lighting removal because apparently their Christmas lights were still up in mid-January, and the covenant required removal by January 15th, which fell during the blizzard. That last one was a particularly nice touch. She had cited a family for not taking down their Christmas lights during a blizzard that had buried the entire neighborhood under 2 feet of snow and knocked out power to half the street. The neighborhood was not just frustrated. People were angry, real, genuine, organized angry. Tom Garrettson, who I had helped clear his driveway that morning, wrote a long comment explaining that he had personally watched me plow, and that it had been a completely reasonable and necessary activity, and that Pamela's fine was an abuse of authority. Felix Torres, one of the 2 board members who was not in Pamela's pocket, commented publicly that he had not been consulted about the blizzard-related violation notices and that he was looking into the matter. Donna Hewitt, the retired schoolteacher, left a comment that simply said, "This is exactly the behavior I have been trying to get addressed for 2 years." The post went beyond the neighborhood Facebook group pretty quickly. Someone shared it to a regional community forum, and then someone else picked it up and shared it to a national HOA-related Reddit community, which, if you have never been there, is a place where people who have dealt with abusive HOAs go to share their experiences and collectively lose their minds over the pettiness of it all. Within 48 hours, my story had tens of thousands of views, and people were sending me messages from 3 states away offering advice, moral support, and in a few cases, referrals to attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. Meanwhile, inside Maplewood Ridge, something was starting to shift. People who had been quietly tolerating Pamela's enforcement style for years were suddenly talking to each other in a way they had not before. There were impromptu conversations happening on driveways and in cul-de-sacs. People were sharing violation notices they had received and saved, comparing notes on what Pamela had cited them for, and realizing that a pattern had been developing for years that none of them had individually recognized, because they had all been dealing with it in isolation. It turned out, as these conversations started pooling together, that Pamela had been issuing fines at an extraordinary rate over the past 3 years in particular. And when people started cross-referencing the fines with the actual covenant language, a troubling picture started to emerge. Many of the fines did not have a clear basis in the covenant documents. Some of them cited provisions that did not say what Pamela claimed they said, exactly like what she had done to me. A few fines cited provisions that did not appear to exist in the current version of the covenant at all. Felix Torres and Donna Hewitt were quietly collecting this information. They reached out to me privately to let me know they were building a case to bring to a special board meeting, but they needed a couple more weeks to pull everything together properly. I told them I was not going anywhere and I was happy to contribute anything I had. What I had, it turned out, was a pretty significant piece of documentation that nobody else had thought to collect. Because I had pulled my garage camera footage from the blizzard morning, I started going back through the footage from earlier dates as well, just to see what I had. And I found something genuinely interesting. My garage cameras catch a partial view of the street in front of my house. Not perfect, not wide angle, but decent. And in the footage from multiple evenings over the past several months, I could see Pamela's silver Lexus driving slowly past houses on our street. Slowly enough that it was clearly not normal through traffic. She was doing her compliance drive-thrus in the evening, which I had known she did, but what was interesting was the timing. Because on several occasions, I could correlate the dates and times in my footage with dates on which I or neighbors had received violation notices, and it was pretty clear from the footage that she was driving through right at or just after the start of quiet hours. That by itself was not illegal. But it got me thinking about something else. One of my neighbors, a woman named Carla Meggia who lived 4 houses down, had told me about a particularly infuriating fine she had received the previous summer. Pamela had cited Carla for having a garden shed that was allegedly 3 inches too close to the property line. Carla had fought the fine, provided a survey, and demonstrated that her shed was actually within the required setback. But the fine had been issued anyway and had been upheld by the board on what Carla described as a completely kangaroo court hearing, and Carla had eventually just paid it because the cost of hiring an attorney to fight a $200 fine seemed worse than the fine itself. Carla had, however, kept everything. The violation notice, her response, the survey, the board's ruling, her payment receipt, all of it. And when she pulled it back out and we sat at her kitchen table looking at it one evening, something jumped out that had not been obvious when she was in the middle of the fight. The fine payment had been made out to the HOA management company, as required, but the citation number on the violation notice did not appear in the management company's violation log. Carla had managed to get a copy of the violation log through a records request she had submitted as part of her dispute process, and she had never specifically compared the citation number. When we compared it now, it was not there. The payment had gone through and presumably been deposited, but the citation that had generated the payment had no corresponding entry in the official records. This was not necessarily evidence of anything on its own. Records get mislabeled. Administrative errors happen, but it was a thread worth pulling. I brought this to Felix Torres' attention, and Felix, who it turned out had a background in accounting before he retired, started looking very carefully at the HOA's financial records, which board members had a right to access. What he found over the next 2 weeks, while doing this very quietly and methodically, was a pattern of discrepancies. Fine payments were coming in at the management company level, but not all of them were showing up in the HOA's general operating account in the amounts they should have. The amounts were not enormous individually. We are talking about $200 here, $300 there, occasionally a $400 or $500 enforcement fine for larger violations. But they were adding up. And when Felix cross-referenced the discrepancy pattern against the period during which violation fines had been escalating, the numbers pointed in a very specific direction. Pamela Covington had a side arrangement with the HOA management company. At least, that was the theory Felix was developing. The management company was not a large operation. It was basically a three-person office that handled several small HOAs in the region, and one of the three people running it was Pamela's cousin, a guy named Russell Covington. That relationship had never been disclosed to the full board when the management company contract was signed. Felix had gone back and looked, and it was nowhere in the meeting minutes. Felix brought in a forensic accountant friend of his, just informally at first, to look at what he had assembled. The forensic accountant looked at it for about 2 days and then told Felix, very calmly, that what Felix had was not just sloppy bookkeeping. What he had, if the pattern held up under formal audit, looked like the potential diversion of HOA funds through inflated fine revenues being partly redirected, rather than fully deposited to the community account. In plain English, it looked like some of the fines Pamela had been issuing and that residents had been paying were being skimmed, with a portion potentially going somewhere other than the HOA operating fund. That was when things moved from a neighborhood dispute into criminal territory. Felix came to me privately because I had been the public face of the dispute, and because he trusted me to handle the information carefully. We sat in his living room on a Tuesday evening with mugs of hot coffee because it was still brutally cold outside, weeks after the blizzard, with ice still banked up along the sides of the streets, and he walked me through what the forensic accountant had told him. I remember staring at my coffee mug for a long moment after he finished, because this had started as a $250 fine for plowing my driveway, and it had apparently become a financial fraud investigation. We agreed that this needed to go to the police, not to the HOA, not to the management company, to the actual police. Felix drafted a formal complaint, attached the documentation the forensic accountant had assembled, added the undisclosed conflict of interest relationship between Pamela and the management company, and filed it with the County Financial Crimes Unit. I filed a supporting statement with my documentation, including the camera footage, the violation notice, and the timeline of events since the blizzard. While the police were starting to look into the financial piece, the board situation was also coming to a head. Felix and Donna had called a special board meeting, which they had the authority to do under the HOA bylaws, with a request from at least 30% of residents. They had gotten close to 60% of residents to sign the petition for the meeting, which I suspect was a record for the neighborhood. The meeting was set for a Thursday evening at the community center, which was a small building at the entrance to the neighborhood that had a meeting room that held about 40 people. 78 residents showed up. People were standing in the hallway and out in the parking lot in the cold, getting updates through the door. Pamela showed up to that meeting like she was walking into a routine budget discussion. She had her clipboard. She was wearing this burgundy blazer that she apparently considered her official HOA regalia. She sat down at the board table and looked out at the room full of unhappy faces, with the expression of someone who had not yet understood that the ground had shifted under her feet entirely. Felix opened the meeting and immediately moved to place the financial discrepancy matter on the agenda as an emergency item. Pamela objected, saying it was not a properly noticed agenda item. Felix pointed out that emergency financial matters could be raised under Section 8 of the bylaws without prior notice. Pamela started to argue, and Gerald Whitmore started to back her up, and then Donna Hewitt put a stack of documents on the table and said, in the firm, precise voice of someone who had spent 30 years managing a classroom full of 12-year-olds, that she would like the meeting to please continue without further interruption. The room went quiet. Felix walked through the financial discrepancies methodically. He had printed summaries for every board member and had copies available for any resident who wanted one. He explained the undisclosed relationship between Pamela and the management company. He explained the pattern of violations that did not appear in official records despite having generated payments. He noted that a forensic accountant had reviewed the materials and recommended a formal audit. Pamela's composure cracked somewhere around the third page of documents Felix presented. She started talking about misunderstandings and accounting errors, and how she had always acted in the best interest of the community. Then she tried a different angle and started talking about how the real issue was that residents were not taking the covenant seriously, and how she had just been doing her job. Gerald Whitmore, who I genuinely do not think had known about any of the financial stuff, was sitting next to her looking like he had just discovered his chair was on fire. Sandra Whitmore was completely silent. Someone from the back of the room, I could not see who, called out asking about my blizzard fine specifically. Felix said it was also on the agenda. He read the violation notice aloud, then read the relevant covenant language aloud, then explained that the provision Pamela had cited applied to recreational vehicles and had no application to snow removal equipment. A county ordinance handout went around the room. The motion to rescind my fine and the other blizzard-related fines was made, seconded, and passed 5-0, because even Gerald and Sandra were not willing to vote in favor of those fines once the legal analysis was laid out in front of 78 people. Pamela tried to leave the meeting early. She stood up and announced that she had said everything she needed to say and was not going to continue to sit through what she called an organized harassment campaign. Someone near the door politely told her she was welcome to leave. She gathered her clipboard and her burgundy blazer and walked out. The meeting continued without her. By the end of that night, the board had voted to suspend Pamela from her enforcement duties pending the outcome of the financial investigation, to engage an independent auditor to review the HOA's financials for the past 5 years, to terminate the contract with the management company pending the investigation, and to issue a formal notice to all residents that any fines issued in the past 90 days were being reviewed for validity, and that residents with concerns should submit them to Felix or Donna for review. It was a clean sweep. 5 hours after it started, the meeting ended with people standing around in the parking lot in the cold, breath fogging in the air, actually talking to each other and laughing and feeling like something had genuinely changed. Tom Garrettson shook my hand in the parking lot and told me that filing that first response letter instead of just paying the fine was the thing that started all of this, and that the neighborhood owed me one. I told him the neighborhood owed me a replacement snowblower because mine had started making a grinding noise during the cleanup after the blizzard, and I was pretty sure a bearing was going out. He laughed and said he would think about it. The financial investigation took about 4 months to fully resolve, which I know sounds like a long time, but is actually pretty fast for this kind of thing. The independent auditor confirmed the discrepancies Felix had identified. The total amount of funds that had been improperly diverted was determined to be somewhere in the range of $11,000 over 3 years. Not an enormous number in the grand scheme of white-collar crime, but very much a real crime with real victims, those victims being every single homeowner who had paid into the HOA over that period. The police investigation that had started with Felix's complaint expanded after the audit confirmed the numbers. Pamela Covington and her cousin Russell at the management company were both formally charged with misappropriation of funds, breach of fiduciary duty, and a couple of related charges that the district attorney's office added after reviewing the case. The case was not headline news or anything. It was local news. There was a short story in the county newspaper, but within the neighborhood it was a significant moment. Pamela entered a guilty plea about 2 months after the charges were filed. She received a sentence that included probation, community service, full restitution of the $11,000, and was permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in the county. Russell received a similar plea and sentence. The management company closed. The $11,000 in restitution was paid back to the HOA operating fund and was used, somewhat poetically, to fund improvements to the community snow removal procedures. The HOA hired a professional snow clearing service to handle the main roads and common areas of the neighborhood during major storms, so residents would have at least some infrastructure support during events like the blizzard. Felix Torres proposed this use of the funds at a board meeting, and it passed unanimously. I got my $250 fine officially rescinded, confirmed in writing, with an apology letter from the board signed by all 5 members. Felix told me privately that the apology letter had been his idea and that he had insisted on it. I appreciated that. The blizzard fines that had been issued to the other 4 households were also rescinded, every one of them. The family with the Christmas lights got a personal apology from Donna Hewitt, who felt particularly bad about that one because she knew that family and felt that the timing of the notice, during an active blizzard, had been especially cruel. The family told Donna it was fine and invited her over for dinner, and from what I heard later, they all had a very nice evening. After everything settled down, the neighborhood went through a real governance overhaul. Elections were held for the HOA board, with proper notice and a legitimate process that I was not sure had been followed in years. Felix and Donna were re-elected. 3 new members were added, including Tom Garrettson, who ran on a platform of basically just being a reasonable person, which in the context of recent events was a genuinely compelling campaign message. The new board rewrote several provisions of the enforcement procedures to require that any fine citation include the specific covenant language being violated, require that citation language actually match the behavior being cited, require disclosure of any relationships between board members and HOA vendors, and require that any fines exceeding a certain threshold be reviewed by the full board before being issued. That last one was the most important, I think. The concentrated enforcement power that Pamela had built up as the sole covenant compliance officer, reporting only to a board where she had 2 loyal votes, was exactly what had allowed the situation to spiral so far. Distributing that power and building in checks made it much harder for any one person to abuse the system the same way again. The neighborhood Facebook group, which had been primarily a place for people to argue about who parked where and share lost dog notices, became genuinely active in a positive way. People organized a neighborhood snow-clearing mutual aid arrangement for elderly and disabled residents. If a storm was coming and someone needed help clearing their driveway, they could post in the group, and within a couple of hours multiple neighbors would volunteer. This was not an HOA initiative. This was just people deciding to look out for each other, which is what a neighborhood is actually supposed to be. The winter after the blizzard was notably milder, which I choose to interpret as the universe acknowledging that we had been through enough. We got a few good storms, nothing historic. The professional snow clearing service handled the common areas efficiently. Residents cleared their own driveways as needed, at whatever time of day the situation required, without any fines, without any clipboard-wielding Lexus SUV driving slowly past their houses in the dark. I invested in a new snowblower that following October, because the bearing in my old one had indeed gone out entirely by the end of that first winter. I also kept the plow attachment on my truck, because old habits die hard, and because you never really know when you are going to need it. I also made sure my garage cameras were updated and working properly, and I backed up footage regularly, because it turned out that habit had been worth approximately $11,000 in recovered HOA funds, and one very satisfying criminal prosecution. Tom Garrettson stopped by one evening in early December, a few weeks before the first real snow of the new winter. He brought a 6-pack of decent beer, and we stood in my garage for a while just talking. He asked me if I regretted buying into a neighborhood with an HOA. I thought about it for a moment and told him no, not really, because the HOA itself was not the problem. The problem had been one specific person with unchecked power and questionable ethics, and that person was now on probation and banned from HOA boards for the rest of her life in the county. The HOA, properly run with proper oversight and actual accountability, was fine. Most things are fine when the people running them are actually trying to serve the community rather than themselves. Tom nodded and said that sounded about right. Then he said the new board had sent him a very detailed orientation packet when he joined, including all the covenant documents, the new enforcement procedures, the financial transparency requirements, and a note from Felix reminding all board members that their role was to serve the residents, not to govern them. I told him that was the best use of HOA letterhead I had ever heard of. We drank the beer and watched the first light snow of the new season start to come down outside the garage, soft and quiet, and nothing like the blizzard that had started all of this. The temperature was dropping, maybe in the mid-20s by then, and there was that particular clean smell that comes with fresh snow and cold air. My driveway was already getting a light dusting, nothing a quick pass with the snowblower would not handle in the morning, a reasonable hour, 7 or 8 a.m., broad daylight, no problems. Or 6 a.m. if the situation called for it, because I had read the covenant documents twice now, and I knew exactly what they said and what they did not say, and I was never again going to pay a fine for something that was not actually a violation, and I was never again going to assume that the person sending the violation notice had actually read the documents they were citing. That was probably the most practical lesson in all of this, honestly, not just for HOA situations. For any situation where someone in an authority position comes at you with a rule they claim you have broken, read the actual rule, read it carefully, read it again. Because Pamela Covington had been counting for years on the fact that most people would not bother to look it up, would just assume that the person with the clipboard and the official letterhead knew what they were talking about, would find it easier to pay the fine than to fight it. And she was right about most people, most of the time. She had been doing it successfully for years before anyone pushed back hard enough to expose the whole picture. The thing that changed it was one person, one morning, in the middle of a blizzard, who decided that $250 was the wrong amount to pay for clearing snow off his own driveway. I did not set out to be the person who brought down a corrupt HOA enforcement scheme when I fired up my plow at 6 in the morning that January. I just wanted to get to work. But sometimes the thing that starts a chain of events is that simple. One person refuses to go along with something that is clearly wrong, documents what happened, writes the letter, sends the certified mail, posts the question publicly, and suddenly everyone around them who has been feeling the same frustration realizes they are not alone. Maplewood Ridge is a genuinely nice neighborhood now. I know that sounds like a simple thing to say after everything that happened, but it is worth saying. The streets get plowed. The sidewalks get cleared. Neighbors help each other out when the weather gets bad. The HOA board sends out a newsletter every month with clear and reasonable reminders about actual covenant requirements, written in plain language that does not require a legal degree to decode. Nobody is driving slowly past houses at 7 in the evening looking for something to cite. The community center has a new coat of paint on the outside trim, which the HOA funded with properly tracked money from the operating account. There is a bulletin board inside with a sign-up sheet for the neighborhood snow-clearing mutual aid program. Someone had the idea of putting a laminated copy of the HOA's new enforcement procedures on the board next to it, just so everyone could see them, just so there was no ambiguity. I thought that was a nice touch. My driveway, for what it is worth, is clear, has been clear all winter. I cleared it myself, at whatever hour I needed to, with my truck or my snowblower or a shovel depending on how much had fallen. Not one violation notice, not one complaint. Not one slowly cruising silver Lexus in my camera footage. Just a clean driveway on a winter morning, which is all I ever wanted in the first place. If you are in an HOA situation right now that feels wrong to you, read your governing documents, all of them. Find the specific language the violation notice cites. Compare it to what the notice actually claims. Check your local ordinances, because local law governs and HOA rules cannot override it. Document everything with dates. Send responses by certified mail. Keep copies of everything you send and everything you receive. Ask your neighbors if they have experienced similar things, because you are probably not the only one. Find the board members who are not on the wrong side and let them know you support them doing the right thing. And if it goes beyond HOA petty politics into actual financial misconduct, take it to the people equipped to handle financial misconduct, which is the police, and not another round of HOA meetings. The system does not always work perfectly, but it is more likely to work when someone is willing to push it into motion. That January morning, when I walked into my garage before sunrise, suited up against the worst cold snap of the year, and started clearing my driveway because I had a job to get to and a 2-foot wall of snow between me and it, I did not feel like a hero. I felt cold and tired and slightly annoyed that my truck took longer than usual to warm up because it had been sitting in the cold for 12 hours. I felt like a regular person trying to deal with a real problem in a practical way. Pamela Covington decided to make that ordinary moment into a violation. And in doing so, she started a chain of events that ended with her in front of a judge, a refund to every homeowner in the community, and a neighborhood that actually functions the way a neighborhood is supposed to. Which means that $250 fine might be the most expensive thing she ever decided to issue. I hope she kept her copy of the covenant documents. She is going to have a lot of time on probation to reread them. The snow is falling again outside my window as I finish writing this. Light and steady, a few inches by morning if the forecast is right. I have already checked the snowblower, topped off the fuel, made sure the plow is ready to go in the garage. My neighbor Tom texted me an hour ago to ask if I could do a pass on his driveway tomorrow morning if I was heading out anyway, since his backup snowblower is still in pieces in his garage waiting for a replacement part to arrive. I told him, of course. 7 a.m. No problem. Not 6, 7, because I am a reasonable person, and also because Tom is on the HOA board now and I would really like to stay on his good side.